So there's this show. It's called Attack on Titan.
As a fascist, I am constantly trying to convert other people to my ideology by recommending Attack on Titan.
There are some theories out there, not all of them flattering to the show. China, for example, is so convinced that the show is Japanese military propaganda that they've banned it entirely.
Certainly there are iconographic elements that I feel come off like they could be also part of a fascist story, but that's just not the vibe that I get from this.
And cancel now. All right, no, actually, just cancel anime. Okay?
Polygon is increasingly bringing in freelancers to write clickbait.
So what they're gonna do is now label these problematic animes as gateways to hate and the alt-right.
AOT, this shit is fascist propaganda and people still act like it's not a problem, lol. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, and this is what you see, and these people aren't even fans.
Despite the fact that the overall storyline is not only bringing joy to millions, but will bring joy to you if you don't want to be a vile kiss-ass, and you want to maybe open your eyes to appreciate something really, really great that's going on.
If there's any uncontroversial statement about Attack on Titan, it's that the show has generated a lot of discussion. People have a lot of feelings about what the show means to them, and people have a lot of opinions about what the show may or may not be saying. And so I'd argue the discourse around the show is pretty fascinating and definitely worth our time to take a look at. So that's ultimately what I'm trying to do here. Now this is going to require us to examine the text of Attack on Titan, i.e. the manga and the show, because it is a little hard to comment on people commenting on something if you don't talk about that thing they're commenting on. So I hope you'll bear with me as we crest a couple horizons talking about the show before we fully start talking about the show. But also, I'm winging this shit, so let's just see where it goes. And with that, let's get into it. Preamble. What is Attack on Titan discourse? Or, what the hell are these weebs arguing about? Well, broadly speaking, Attack on Titan discourse centers around whether or not the show embodies a certain message or ideology, or whether it expresses certain values. More or less, people are typically arguing over what, if anything, the show is saying. Not that there isn't discussion about world building in Attack on Titan, but the discourse around the show generally centers around whether or not Attack on Titan is fascist. Shocking, the discussion of fascism being controversial. I never would have guessed. But getting back into it, there's actually a fair amount of nuance going on here, and Attack on Titan is or Attack on Titan isn't fascist are far from the only two positions in the discourse. So I find it somewhat helpful to break down Attack on Titan discourse into three basic walls or camps. Like how more or less the main character's home is broadly separated into three walls. We have a certain subset of the fandom that seems to legitimately believe and argue from the position that anime is meaningless. It's just anime, and therefore as art, it can say nothing, political or otherwise. For these people, at the end of the day, Attack on Titan is just Attack on Titan. Now the second and extremely prominent group or wall here hold a pretty different opinion than this. And this category contains people that believe Attack on Titan has a very positive message, typically an anti-war message, an anti-imperialist message. And oftentimes the claim is made within this group that Attack on Titan actually serves as a warning against fascism. And last but certainly not least, we have our final wall, which, as you may have guessed, is comprised of people that believe that Attack on Titan is in some way fascistic or promoting fascism or embodies fascist viewpoints. Now, they can't seem to agree on whether or not this is a good thing or not, and so this category contains both groups. Groups that both unironically endorse the show and Eren because they believe they are positive affirmations of the values of fascism and exterminationism. And then, of course, there are those who believe that the anime promoting these values or ideologies or concepts is a bad thing. Now, I think right off the bat, we can safely dismiss the first category. These are silly people who clearly don't know what they're talking about. If what they believed was true, then Animal Farm would be no different than a zoo book or a trip to the petting zoo. In reality, as a piece of literature, it is considerably different than both those two things, and so I think we can safely agree that art can and does carry meaning. And so what we're left with in Attack on Titan discourse is pretty polarizing, right? We basically have two inverted interpretations of the series. At this point, you've probably guessed, to discuss the discourse further, we're probably going to have to figure out if either side's ideas hold any water. So, in my IRL life, when people come to me and ask me, is X thing fascist? I usually find it's a little bit easier to break that down into smaller subsets of questions. Because particularly with stories as complex and long as Attack on Titan, oftentimes we find there is some discrepancy in what's being presented, and so things can get bogged down in sort of a tit-for-tat kind of argument, rather than viewing the work in aggregate, or trying to determine if there are some undercurrent of themes that might influence all of the other parts of the story. So that said, I think we should shake a stick at one of the most commonly asked questions, and one that was presented here by this Korra poster. And as you can see, it's that same question we ended the opening credits with. So let's see if we can dive in here and provide our Korra friend with a little bit of an answer to their question. And with that, part 1, the Nazi general in the room. So as it turns out, Erwin Smith, the commander of the Scouts, is a rendition of the real-life Nazi general Erwin Rommel. And this is a little bit more than just an inspired-by situation. This is a very particular portrayal of Erwin Rommel that does in fact have its roots in Nazi propaganda. Now, Erwin Rommel's legacy, and thus Erwin Rommel's portrayal, has been played around with by quite a number of people over the years, and notably by Rommel himself. Rommel's legacy and Rommel mythology in general could also probably be classified under the greater umbrella of clean Wehrmacht mythology. But because this isn't a video about Erwin Rommel, and we probably don't have time for all of that, I came up with a fun little thought experiment for you. If I, in my own house, were to draw a replica or copy of an ad for Coca-Cola from a magazine printed by Coca-Cola, have I produced a Coca-Cola ad? I mean, I wasn't creating the drawing at the behest of the Coca-Cola Corporation, but I also have done nothing to alter the image of Coca-Cola the company would like you to be interpreting and receiving. Well, let's put a pin in that and think on it, and shift gears to ask, who exactly is Erwin Rommel anyhow? Well, Rommel is basically a career soldier. He fought in the First World War in the service of the German Empire and Kaiser Wilhelm II. He remained in the army after the war. Rommel would forswear his oath to the Republic in favor of allegiance to Hitler, and continue service in the armed forces after Hitler's consolidation of power. In and around this time, Rommel worked as an instructor at a military academy, where he would eventually go on to write a book called Infantry Attacks, incorporating some of his experiences in the First World War. And all of this occurs more or less around the same time as the Nuremberg race laws are being passed. In 1937, Rommel was posted to a position as liaison to the Hitler Youth. He was then again transferred in 1938, on Hitler's request, to the Führer's personal bodyguard battalion. In 1939, a newly promoted General Major Erwin Rommel was assigned to the newly formed FBB, a unit which was designed to escort and protect Hitler while he traveled the front. Leading this unit would be Rommel's role during the Polish campaign, an extensively brutal campaign in which many of the operational tactics that would come to define the Holocaust would begin to be implemented. Following the Polish campaign, Rommel would go on to petition for and be granted command of a Panzer Division, and he would lead the 7th Panzer Division in the Nazi invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. These campaigns were again characterized by extreme brutality, and these countries would go on to become sites of some of the most horrific crimes in all of human history. After the Nazi victories, Rommel would take part in a propaganda film that required and featured the forced labor of prisoners of war. In early 1941, Rommel would be reassigned yet again to the newly formed Africa Corps. Nazi operations in Africa would be where Rommel would earn the majority of his fame, both during the war and after. Far from being a clean or gentleman's war, the campaigns in Africa, conducted by both the Italians and the Germans, would yet again be stamped with the hallmark of extreme brutality and exterminationism. And though Axis forces were defeated and thus unable to consolidate control over North Africa and the Middle East, there had been the formation of an Einsatz group in Egypt under the command of Walter Rauff, already notorious for his work with the mobile gas chambers. Shortly before the surrender of Nazi forces, Rommel turned over his command to Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who conducted some final mistreatment of the Jewish community before Axis forces were driven from North Africa. Rommel is then briefly shuffled off to Greece, a nation that was also deeply affected by Nazi occupation. However, he is recalled almost instantaneously and reassigned to Italy, where he, along with many others, took part in the forceful disarming of Italian soldiers. Shortly after these operations, Rommel is reposted out of Italy and into France. And it is during his time in France, not too long after the Allied invasions of Normandy, that Rommel would be implicated in a plot to kill Hitler. Rommel was ultimately given the choice to preserve his legacy and the public face of the regime by taking his own life, and he did so in October of 1944. Now this last part deserves a little bit of attention, so I'm going to read for you briefly from an excerpt written by historian Russell A. Hart. Like many of those ultimately snared in the vicious Nazi backlash that led to almost 5,000 deaths, Rommel's involvement remains ambiguous and unclear, but clearly it was much more minor than both his Gestapo inquirers and many historians have subsequently concluded. In reality, Erwin Rommel was not a member of the July 20th conspiracy. A Board assassination was only superficially connected with the anti-Hitler resistance, and therefore it is highly improbable that he would have actively aided in the coup d'etat on July 20th if he had not been incapacitated. And Hart continues by saying, a careful sifting and weighing of the limited, fragmentary, problematic, and ambiguous extant evidence suggests that Rommel had at the very best superficial knowledge of ill-defined efforts by an amorphous group of army officers and others to extricate Germany from impending defeat. Moreover, not only was he only very peripherally involved in the anti-Hitler resistance, but his supposed commitment to the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, a la Spiegel, is highly implausible. Rommel did share something very important with the conspirators, a fervent anti-Bolshevism. And like the conspirators, he believed the best and indeed only path forward for Nazi Germany was to make peace with the Western Allies, compromising in the West in order to reconsolidate and attain their goals in the East. And though Rommel never served in the East, he was a fervent supporter of war against the Soviet Union, and like all leaders of Nazi armed forces, he is inextricable from the war, and inextricable from the war aims and long-term strategic goals, those of mass extermination and enslavement. So that's who Rommel is. This, however, is far from how Rommel is remembered, and indeed even farther from how Rommel is portrayed. And to get a better picture of how Rommel is portrayed and understood today, we need not look much further than how he was presented in Reich propaganda. With meticulous film work, staging, and reshoots, Rommel was always presented as a stoic, commanding, heroic badass. Honorable, gentlemanly, respected, picture perfect. And this is the image and perception that has been nurtured, maintained, and propagated in virtually all media featuring the Field Marshal. It's a little bit like that weird question I asked at the beginning of this section. Now, obviously Rommel's legacy is quite a bit more complex than what we have time to go into here. And that thought experiment I asked you to ponder is a little bit one-dimensional to encompass how his legacy was formed. A slightly better crude visual aid might be something like this, as over time, much has been added to Rommel's legacy to make him seem extra badass and cool and epic, and the critical aspects of his loyalty to the Führer and participation in the aggressive Nazi wars is somewhat sidelined, though not entirely. What you're left with is a legacy that, while heavily embellished, has a very clear through line to its roots in Nazi propaganda. Scrub all you like, I guess, that Goebbels don't come out easy. So, let's talk about Erwin Smith. Erwin Smith is basically the final boss of the Rommel myth. He is everything the Reich's Ministry of Propaganda would have liked you to think of Erwin Rommel. Epic 420 XD. He is the propaganda and mythology surrounding Rommel turned up to 11. A glorious, fearless, heroic, sword-wielding commander who leads his adoring men into battle. He's so super smart and awesome, and of course, because he's a wonderful guy, he leads the coup against the corrupt evil government. He is, figuratively and literally, softcore Veraboo porn? Both because he can be worshipped and exonerated safely because he's not technically Erwin Rommel, though he totally actually is, but also because he is just literally on occasion softcore Veraboo porn. Now, I'm far from the only person to have noticed this. I found plenty of little memes and commentaries and writings about how Erwin Smith is Erwin Rommel, but they all seem to share one thing in common, and that was pretty low engagement. This does not appear, at least, to be a major part of Attack on Titan discourse or discussion. For example, in many of the popular articles, no mention of the Nazi commander appears. YouTube videos diving into the topic seem to have a similar problem, and out of the many YouTube videos I have watched about the topic, I believe Lost Future's second Attack on Titan video is the only video with any real traction to mention Rommel. Now, this all to me does seem a little bit strange, and hopefully it seems a little bit strange to you too. If we're arguing over whether or not something is pro or anti-militaristic or imperialistic or pro or anti-fascist, then it does seem like a pretty big oversight, either intentionally or unintentionally, to leave out some diligent commentary on a figure that is an overly glorified insert of a man who literally led Nazi armies. I don't know, it just kind of feels like something that should be at the forefront of the discussion to me. And so, here we are, beginning of the video, talking about Erwin Rommel. So what can we learn from all this, and how does this help us answer our Korra friends question? Well, it helps us because now we can say with confidence that while Attack on Titan may not be Nazi propaganda in its entirety, it certainly contains Nazi propaganda within it. Now, one could argue that the propaganda it contains is relatively benign. One could argue the author only has a flawed and very common understanding of Rommel, and thus did not intend to include this propaganda, but did so through more or less an accidental translation. And one could certainly argue that in spite of this, Attack on Titan maintains an anti-war or anti-fascist message. But you can't argue that it's not there. Now, I'd be the first to admit that the mere presence of a Nazi general is not necessarily a definitive gotcha in the argument of whether or not Attack on Titan is in aggregate a fascist piece of media. I would say that it doesn't bode well for the argument that it's not, but one character does not a whole series make. And so I think before we start to answer any more questions, or try to finish off the second half of our Korra friends question, we better jump into part 2 of the video. And so, here we go. Part 2, This is a Cruel World, or the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. So, let's get into it. Something that has defined the discourse around Attack on Titan is the seeming dissonance within the series, particularly when it comes to how the series feels about warfare, and to a larger degree, conflict in general. With proponents of the idea that Attack on Titan has an anti-war message citing the numerous scenes within manga and anime that seem to speak to the fact that war is horrifying. If one watches the series in its entirety, it's not hard to pick up on the fact that there is a deep through line about war affecting both sides of the conflict extraordinarily negatively. And not just those involved in fighting the war directly, but those who are uninvolved in directly engaging in the violence themselves. Attack on Titan also comments on how those who are extremely young can be absorbed into the cycle of warfare, and how war can come to occupy the entirety of a young person's life. However, it has also been equally noted by detractors of the series that violence and warfare are overtly glorified within the series, and strength and power through conflict are seen as something certainly necessary, if not aspirational. We get what many see as the obvious denouncement of war because of its horrible qualities, and we also get what many see as the glorification of war and the promotion of the idea that strength through conflict is a good thing. And so trying to wrestle with this dissonance and block Attack on Titan into a definitively pro-war or anti-war camp has become a major focal point of fan-based argument. So as you may have guessed, at this point, I'm gonna have us ask one of those trademark weird questions. What's stopping all of these things from being true at once within the story? Can war be bad and glorifying at the same time? Can it be horrible, but also a necessity? Can warfare be an inescapable defining element of existence? Carl Schmitt is a legal and social theorist born in 1888. He was an unrepentant Nazi until his death, and is often seen as one of the quintessential fascist thinkers, particularly when it comes to Nazism. Now, you may already be familiar with this guy, and if you are, odds are it's because of a little treatise he wrote called The Concept of the Political. Now, in The Concept of the Political, Schmitt argues that the most basic element in human interaction is the grouping of friends and enemies, and the distinction between these two. In Schmitt's writing, he's very careful to take a pretty amoral stance around this. Like, Schmitt's not trying to convince you that it's a positive or a negative thing that human beings define themselves by a friend-enemy distinction. He is, however, attempting to get you to accept that this premise is true. For our purposes, I'm just going to read you a little bit here so you kind of get the idea of what we're talking about. Schmitt will, for example, say, "The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. He need not appear as an economic competitor, and it may even be advantageous to engage with him in business transactions. But he is, nevertheless, the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is, in a specially intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that, in the extreme case, conflicts with him are possible." And Schmitt's views on warfare follow from this understanding. He says, "War is neither the aim nor the purpose nor even the content of politics, but as an ever-present possibility, it is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specific political behavior." Now again, Schmitt is not trying to convince you that this is a positive or negative arrangement, and he's not trying to sell you on the ethical value of such dichotomies. In fact, Schmitt writes that it is irrelevant here whether one rejects, accepts, or perhaps finds it an atavistic remnant of barbaric times that nations continue to group themselves according to friend and enemy, or hopes that the antithesis will one day vanish from the world, or whether it is perhaps sound pedagogic reasoning to imagine that enemies no longer exist at all. The concern here is neither with abstractions nor with normative ideals, but with inherent reality and the real possibility of such a distinction. Now, obviously there's a lot more to Schmitt, and this is kind of just the initial premise that Schmitt is asking you to accept so that he can build on it. But I feel like Schmitt is good for the conversation, both because Schmitt provides a great lens for us to look at the material, that being Attack on Titan in manga and anime form, and because this is not the first time that Schmitt has entered the chat when it comes to online discourse around Attack on Titan. According to YouTube, it was around 6 years ago when Wisecrack dropped their video about the philosophy of Attack on Titan, in which they explained in very good detail how Schmitt's philosophy provides a great view when examining the show. Now, they only covered the first season, and I was a little bit dissatisfied with an aspect of their conclusion. However, this Reddit post from 2 years ago picks up exactly where they left off, and provides a much better analysis through the lens of Carl Schmitt. The Reddit essay correctly identifies the Schmittian theme of devour or be devoured that permeates the series. It identifies the appeals to a so-called cruel natural order that is supposed to replicate the realities of nature and is a continuation of the devour or be devoured theme. It delivers excellent commentary on how the series and writing intentionally narrows things down to where there is only a kill or be killed solution, voiding all other potential options. And it addresses the fact that Attack on Titan is sympathetic to the suffering on both sides of conflict in a way that many other commenters and essays simply fail to do. After all, in Schmitt's thinking, the enemy isn't necessarily the enemy because you hate him. You might, but that's not why he's the enemy. As Schmidt writes, the morally evil, aesthetically ugly, or economically damaging need not necessarily be the enemy. The morally good, aesthetically beautiful, and economically profitable need not necessarily become the friend in the specifically political sense of the word. Thereby, the inherent objective nature and autonomy of the political becomes evident by its virtue of being able to treat, distinguish, and comprehend the friend-enemy antithesis independently from other antitheses. Now, perhaps most importantly, the essay picks up on the consistent through line in Attack on Titan, that being the permanence of conflict and warfare. I think it's very important to point out at this point in the conversation that this attitude towards conflict, warfare, and their relationship to nature, or what is natural, is not unique to Schmidt, and actually is a very deep through line in fascist thought in general. For example, here's a few excerpts I pulled from Mein Kampf. He who would live must fight. He who does not wish to fight in this world where permanent struggle is the law of life has no right to exist. Man must realize that his fundamental law of necessity reigns through the whole realm of nature, and that his existence is subject to the law of eternal struggle and strife. Nature knows no political frontiers. She begins by establishing life on the globe and then watches the free play of forces. Those who show the greatest courage and industry are the children nearest to her heart, and they will be granted the sovereign right of existence. When the courage to fight for one's own health is no longer in evidence, the right to live in this world of struggle also ceases. If you prefer a more Mediterranean flavor of fascist, then Fascismo Classic also has you covered on this very concept. From the doctrine of fascism. Fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or unity of perpetual peace. It therefore discards pacifism as a cloak for cowardly, supine renunciation, in contradistinction to self-sacrifice. War alone keys up all human energies to their maximum tensions and sets the seal of nobility on those peoples who have the courage to face it. Fascism carries this anti-pacifistic attitude into the life of the individual. I don't care a damn, me ne fregro. The proud motto of the fighting squad, scrawled by a wounded man on his bandages, is not only an act of philosophical stoicism, it sums up a doctrine which is not merely political. It is further stated in the doctrine of fascism that fascism is therefore opposed to all individualistic abstractions based on 18th century materialism, and is opposed to all Jacobinistic utopias and innovations. It does not believe in the possibility of happiness on earth as conceived by the economist literature of the 18th century, and it therefore rejects the theological notion that at some future time the human family will secure a settlement of all its difficulties. Kita Terajiro, in his Outline for the Reorganization of Japan, also clearly expresses thoughts that embrace this perspective. He says, "How can those who are concerned with this inevitable future or saddened by the wretched state of neighboring countries find comfort in the pacifist ideas of doctrinaire socialism? I can positively say that there is no denying a society progresses through class war, but what is this so-called social science that closes its eyes to wars between people and wars between nations that have taken place since the beginning of mankind?" And reaching slightly forward into the future, the ever-so-comedic figure of Yukio Mishima, when commenting on what he sees as the devour or be devoured, dog-eat-dog world of culture, says the following: "The cold reality is that in defending culture, force is required, just as it is to defend all other things, and that it is the creators and maintainers of culture themselves to whom that force must belong. At the same time, the idea that the actions and methods of defending peace must all be peaceful is a general delusion of culturalism and one form of the feminine illogic that is dominating post-war Japan." Now, in spite of this being a very consistent through line for fascist thinkers and philosophers, clearly one does not need to be a fascist to embrace the idea that war is a non-stop constant or defining aspect of reality and human existence. And that brings us around to the end of the article here. I think what the author says about Schmidt's thoughts on the work really hit home, but the author does leave us with a bit of a question of their own at the end. Can Attack on Titan be read not fascistically, but as some form of standalone belief in nihilistic inevitability? In a recent interview, Isayama, the author of Attack on Titan, said the following, in response to an interview question. The manga ends with you showing the future of parody and sort of the cycle of war continuing. Is there no end to the conflict and the cycle you present in the story? I guess there could have been an ending where it was a happy ending, and the war ended and everything was fine and dandy. I guess that could have been possible. At the same time, the end of fighting and the end of contention itself seems kind of hokey. It seems kind of like not even believable. It's just not plausible in the world we're living in right now, so sadly, I had to give up on that kind of happy ending. This carries with it both echoes of Eren in the manga and anime, and Schmidt himself in the sort of detached, amoral sense that this is not being advocated for as a good thing, but it is being advocated for as a natural and real thing. So, is Attack on Titan merely expressing Isayama's personal deterministic nihilism? Well, it's this point that I would propose the idea that perhaps nihilistic inevitability and fascism, or the ending results of fascistic thought, are perhaps not necessarily two disconnected things, but instead perhaps two parts of the same trajectory. And so, both to help me make this claim a little bit more eloquently, and hopefully to offer us a new lens to look through, I'd like to bring in an idea put forward by historian and Holocaust scholar Timothy Snyder. Snyder writes about two concepts that he calls the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. He describes the politics of inevitability as a sense that the future is just more of the present, that the laws of progress are known, that there are no alternatives and therefore nothing really to be done. Snyder tells us that the cliché of the politics of inevitability is that there are no alternatives. To accept this is to deny individual responsibility for seeing history and making change. Life becomes a sleepwalk to a permanent pre-marked grave in a pre-purchased plot. But the politics of inevitability do not exist in permanence. The collapse of the politics of inevitability ushers in another experience of time, the politics of eternity. Time is no longer a line into the future, but a circle that endlessly returns the same threats from the past. Within eternity, no one is responsible because we all know the enemy is coming, no matter what we do. Authoritarianism begins when we can no longer tell the difference between the true and the appealing. At the same time, the cynic who decides that there is no truth at all is the citizen who becomes the tyrant. Fascism is the falsehood that the enemy chosen by a leader must be the enemy for all. Politics then begins from emotion and falsehood. Peace becomes unthinkable, since enmity abroad is necessary for control at home. I think we can see many of the underlying deterministic and nihilistic elements in Attack on Titan as a form of inevitability politics. And this form of nihilistic inevitability politics sadly provides the ideal base upon which the politics of fascism are constructed. Now, I understand this is kind of a complex argument that I'm putting forth, that accepting elements of determinist and nihilistic thought are essential for constructing fascist ideology. However, I would ask you to explore this idea with me on the basis that we can see Isayama's thoughts, and they do appear to align with certain premises that are put forward by fascist thinkers, even if those premises might alone be considered purely deterministic nihilism. And it's at this point that I think it's good for us to start examining certain other fascistic concepts that appear within Attack on Titan that I see as potentially growing from this underlying nihilistic view. Now, #true fans amongst you have probably surmised that we are going to be talking about Bullcut. After all, true fans will no doubt remember Bullcut's problems with institutional reform and human nature. Bullcut passes with the required marks to make it into the military police. However, unlike everyone else who's joining the military police, Bullcut is not here to take it easy, slack off, or enjoy a free ride. Bullcut wants to fix things. And he's motivated to do so on a belief that humans are more or less fundamentally good, and that he would be returning people to their natural state, one of hardworking, good-spirited diligence rather than corruption. Now, one of our main characters, Annie, takes issue with this and attempts to school Bullcut on reality, at least as she sees it. For Annie, people who are do-gooders and trying to change the world through some kind of moral sense of justice are an abnormality. She calls them special. And Annie puts forth the idea that to be worthless, evil, and not an upright person is to be regular. She argues that if humans were inherently good, then institutions would never be bad. And this argument seems to work on Bolcut. He reasons that if it's human nature that is flawed, and humans themselves that are evil, perhaps it's institution that needs to change to reflect that. Now, the more dweebish amongst you may be picking up notes of Hobbes here. No, not the cool one. Yeah, the weird one. And the more religious amongst you may be picking up the overtones of original sin, and the more Christian idea that man has an evil nature. So how does any of this relate to fascist thought? Well, our boy Schmidt actually uses this very same argument as a core element of his argument against liberalism, socialism, and anarchism, and any ideologies in that same category that he thinks view human beings as inherently good. Quoting again here from the concept of the political, a part of the theory and postulates which presuppose man to be good is liberal. Without being actually anarchist, they are polemically directed against the intervention of the state. Ingenious anarchism reveals that the belief in the natural goodness of man is closely tied to the radical denial of the state and government. One follows from the other, and both foment each other. For the liberals, on the other hand, the goodness of man signifies nothing more than the argument with whose aid the state is made to serve society. And if there are any Russian Christo-fascists in the audience, you may be recalling the words of Ivan Ilyin in On Resistance to Evil by Force, where he stated, "Evil is first and foremost the spiritual inclination of man, inherent in each of us, as if for some living within us there is a passionate desire to unbridle the beast inside. A gravitation that always strives to expand its field and to overtake us completely." And since I brought up Hobbes and the Bible briefly just a moment earlier, I'd like us to take a look at another passage that shows us the unity between what Schmidt is saying and what Annie is saying. The fundamental theological dogma of the evilness of the world and man leads, just as does the distinction of friend and enemy, to a categorization of men and makes impossible the undifferentiated optimism of a universal conception of man. In a good world, among good people, only peace, serenity, and harmony prevail. The methodical connection of theological and political presumptions is clear, but theological interference generally confuses political concepts because it shifts distinction usually into moral theology. Political thinkers such as Machiavelli, Hobbes, and often Fichte presuppose with their pessimism only the reality or possibility of the distinction of friend and enemy. For Hobbes, a truly powerful and systematic political thinker, the pessimistic conception of man is the elementary presupposition of a specific system of political thought. He also recognized correctly that the conviction of each side that it possesses the truth, the good, and the just brings about the worst enmities. Finally, the war of all against all. So at this point, I think it's pretty obvious why Schmidt would be rather enamored with what Annie is laying down here in her discussion with Bolcut. And it also highlights that it's not only one fascist premise that's being put forward in Attack on Titan. Again, we're stepping away from pure deterministic nihilism into coherent political argument. Now, if you don't mind, I need to pivot very briefly without actually pivoting. The saga around Bolcut begins with his concerns about the corruption of the interior and his desire to change that. Now, his interactions with Annie and events that follow change his desire for this. However, I can't help but wonder if he would have come to a similar conclusion if left to his own devices. And this is because of the way Attack on Titan portrays large population concentrations, or the juxtaposition of interior societies and city-based society, as opposed to rural society or small communal society. And again here I'd ask you to bear with me because we're leaving the world of textual analysis and we're entering the world of subtextual analysis. Bolcut's complaint about the interior is not incorrect. The interior is corrupt. It seems to be a hub of intrigue. It seems to be a place where the masses are forgotten or simply seen as fodder to be taken advantage of. And, of course, whatever glimmer of hope or glitter of prosperity the interior does show, it could be merely considered obfuscation from the horrors of the Undercity. The interior, or the more largely populated areas in Attack on Titan, are the dark heart of parody. And indeed, even individuals who might be incompetent or inept or slacking off, like the wine-drinking guards we see in some of the very first panels of the show, those in rural areas lack this inherent decadent evil that is pervasive within characters from the interior and within the interior itself. Attack on Titan also seems to embody the idea that those who come from the more peripheral fringes of society, the hunters, the farmers, the small towners, and those who live in rural areas, are inherently more hardy, a more competent, a more rugged people. And again, this competent ruggedness, this inherent rural strength and goodness, is juxtaposed against the seemingly inherent decadence, corruption, and incompetence of those at the center of society, and those in large population centers. Historian and Holocaust scholar Jason Stanley describes the Hitlerian conception of the juxtaposition between the rural and the urban, or the farmland and the city, in the 9th chapter of his book titled How Fascism Works. Stanley points out that much of the Hitlerian conception is predicated on racial prejudice and built around Hitler's insane racist worldview, but there were large portions of Stanley's writings that really stood out to me when I watched Attack on Titan and noticed the juxtaposition of the corrupt cities and the corrupt interior versus the rural areas. Stanley writes, "Cities in the fascist worldview are collective enterprises where people rely on public infrastructure, the state, for survival and comfort. Residents of cities do not hunt and grow their own food." Stanley further notes that in fascist ideology, the rural life is guided by an ethos of self-sufficiency, which breeds strength. In rural communities, one does not need to depend on the state, unlike the parasites in the city. Hitler writes that a lesson he learned from his time in Vienna was that the social task may never consist of welfare work, which is both ridiculous and useless, but rather in removing the deep-seated mistakes in the organization of our economic and cultural life, which are bound to end in degradation of the individual. These concepts are highly prevalent in fascist thought in general. As another example, here's an excerpt from the 4th essay taken from the book The Culture of Japanese Fascism. An editorial entitled Principles and Policies for the Establishment of Regional Culture, which appeared in early 1941 in the IRAA newspaper, declaring that the correct tradition of Japanese culture exists more today in the regions than in the culture of the center, which has developed under the influence of foreign culture. The article proposed that properly developed regional culture would form the basis of a new national and East Asian culture. Slightly ahead in the same essay, author Kim Brandt notes that the association planner is expected to instill in the workers an appreciation of the culture of daily life, of rural Japan generally, and of their own specific farm villages in particular. And so I'd like to introduce one final observation from Stanley. He notes that in Germany there was a romantic tradition in literature and culture that took cities to be the cause of social ills, and the countryside as a purifying element. Later on in the same paragraph, he quotes from Hitler's Mein Kampf, "A particular danger of the so-called peaceful economic policy of a people lies in the fact that it initially enables increase in the population that will no longer be proportional to the productivity of the people's land and territory. Not infrequently, this crowding of too many people into inadequate Lebensraum also leads to difficult social problems. People are now gathered into work centers that do not resemble cultural sites as much as abscesses on the body of the people, places where all evils, vices, and sicknesses appear to unite." Now, I don't want to make it seem like I'm claiming that if you have a farm or grew up in a small town that you are a fascist. But the center-exterior rural-urban dichotomy that is prevalent in both fascist thought and Attack on Titan should be, I hope, obvious by now. And I think it is worth noting Isayama's own statements on how his experiences growing up on a farm informed his opinions about the cruelty of the world.
I think it came from my experience of growing up in a farm. As a child, I remember thinking all living creatures must get nutrition from other living creatures to survive. We might call it cruel, but it is actually the norm.
普通に会社に就活するように。
There is certainly a nexus point between the text of Attack on Titan, the subtext of the show, and the statements of the author and his own personal experiences which inform the writing. However, there are still a few more topics we need to touch on before we can move forward. And so I'd like to have a brief discussion of how monarchism is deployed and perceived in Attack on Titan. Now, the monarchy at first seems like something of relative importance. It's very important that they get rid of the king of the wrong bloodline and put on the queen of the right bloodline. But this all kind of falls by the wayside, and Historia is eventually relegated to life on a farm, protecting orphans, and eventually having a child. Monarchy is both important but not important in Attack on Titan, and the question of leadership and who should lead society is a strange one. Attack on Titan clearly is not anti-monarchistic. They don't offer up any argument for the dissolution of the monarchy, but it also doesn't seem to present an argument that authority should be derived from and power should be vested in the monarchy. With Attack on Titan seemingly implying that military elites will fill the void in society, without really commenting on whether or not this is a good or a bad thing, but more kind of seemingly demonstrating it as the appropriate thing. So how does this strange conceptualization and deployment of monarchy tie into fascist thought? I'm going to read for you from the writings of Julius Evola. Evola is highly formative on modern far-right thought across a wide spectrum, though he's not often credited. And the section I'm going to read for you is concerning Cornelio Cordrano's writings on monarchy. Cordrano being basically the Homer Simpson of fascist theorists. And if that sounds a little hyperbolic, his text on the Iron Guard would disagree. But I digress. So what does the dastardly duo of Evola and Cordrano say? Well, Evola writes that Cordrano did not exclude that these new forms of nationalism may be compatible with the traditional institutions is proved by his ideas on the monarchical institution, which I find expression in the following words. I reject republicanism. At the head of races, above the elite, there is monarchy. Not all monarchs have been good. Monarchy, however, has always been good. The individual monarch must not be confused with the institution of monarchy. The conclusions drawn from this would be false. There are certainly weak or bad monarchs, but we cannot renounce monarchy. The race has a line of life. A monarch is great and good when he stays on this line. He is petty and bad to the extent that he moves away from this racial line of life, or he opposes it. There are many lines by which a monarch can be tempted. He must set them all aside and follow the line of race. Here is the law of monarchy. And in a lot of ways, this argument against a bad monarch as straying away from the interest of the race is similar to the argument leveled against the false monarch that precedes Historia. And I think Historia can be seen as embodying the aspects of the good monarch as envisioned by Cordrano and Evola. I think we can see aspects of Historia's bizarre brand of selflessness, as well as a tie-in to her self-imposed status as the worst girl in history. But what about those elites that Cordrano spoke of? Does a fascist conception of elites in society mesh up at all with Attack on Titan? Well, again here I believe we can see some through lines, and so I'd like to take a look at Cordrano's writings directly. In his work, For My Legionaries, which are writings about the Iron Guard, Cordrano has a section entitled Election, Selection, and Heredity. Now, interestingly enough, the opening of this selection contains the following lines. I do not talk here of man-made laws. There are norms, natural laws of life, and there are norms, natural laws of death. Laws of life and laws of death. A nation is headed for life or death according to its respect for one or the other of these laws. Which I think provides an insightful tie-in to earlier portions of this section. However, and more appropriately for our purposes currently, Cordrano says the following. A people is not capable of governing itself. It ought to be governed by its elite, namely through that category of men born within its bosom who possess certain aptitudes and specialities. Just as bees raise their queen, a people must raise its elite. The multitude likewise in its needs appeals to its elite, the wise of the state. The more specific role of these elites is explained in the following. The role of an elite is to lead the nation according to the life and laws of the people, to leave behind an inheriting elite. based not on the principle of heredity, but on that of selection, because only an elite knows life's laws and can judge to what extent people conform by aptitudes and knowledge to these laws. On what must an elite be founded? Purity of soul, capacity of work and creativity, bravery, tough living and permanent warring against difficulties facing the nation, poverty, namely voluntary renunciation of amassing a fortune, faith in God, and love. And how are an elite to be chosen? Well, ideally, an elite must be based on the principle of social selection. In other words, a category of people endowed with certain qualities, which they then cultivate, is naturally selected from the nation's body, namely from the large, healthy mass of peasantry and working men, which is permanently bound to the land and country. This category of people becomes the national elite. And what if, like in Parody, the existing elite are corrupt and arguably need to be overthrown? If a nation has no real elite, a first one to designate a second? I answer by a single phrase which contains an indisputable truth. In that case, the real elite is born out of war with the degenerate elite, the false one, and that also on the principle of selection. So I think at this point it's pretty clear what's expected to fill the void that would otherwise potentially be filled by monarchy. I also think it should be fairly obvious how many of these aspects are reflected in, for example, the Survey Corps itself. Clearly one could apply this much more broadly in Attack on Titan, but even just within the scope of the Survey Corps and I suppose later the Corps cast, we can see some undeniable subtextual reflections and through lines. So at this point, if you're still watching the video, you may be a little bit overwhelmed. I've spent the better part of half an hour barraging you with fascist philosophy and literary and film analysis. So not only do I not want us to miss the forest for all the trees, or however that expression goes, but I don't want us to get so bogged down in a tit for tat that we miss the most important element, or thesis if you will, that Attack on Titan puts forward. And many people out there may have been thinking up numerous counterexamples for anything I've said. You, like I, might even have a collection of hundreds of panels that you've gone over, trying to examine the various arguments and trying to determine if there's a consistency in conclusion. Now, unfortunately for us, there are a lot of arguments and conversations and discussions in Attack on Titan, and some of them get quite lengthy. And so it is very easy to get, to borrow a turn of phrase, lost in the sauce. However, poring over all these various panels and political discussions and philosophical arguments, I have noticed one definitive conclusion. And this conclusion seems inescapable no matter what arc of Attack on Titan or what conversation we examine. Because within Attack on Titan, the world is cruel. Enemies are abound. You cannot trust the government or monarchy to save you. And ultimately, whether you are Eren, or Gabby, or Misaka, or Armin, or anyone within this story, you have only one option: to attack, to fight, to keep moving forward. You have enemies out there, whether or not you like that. And if you don't kill them first, they're going to kill you, and they're going to kill your friends. The necessity of violence and the friend-enemy dichotomy are inherent to the world of Attack on Titan, and represent the ultimate thesis and commentary within the text. And it is once we recognize and understand this, that all of the seeming contradiction falls by the wayside. That all of the various elements that don't appear to mesh can harmoniously be brought together under the umbrella of a single thesis statement. Conflict is a fundamental law of nature. Conflict will never end. And if you don't fight, you can't win. So I think it should be obvious by now that the underlying premises and assumptions and theses put forward by Attack on Titan are really not compatible with many ideologies outside of fascism. This may even go a ways towards explaining why liberal, democratic, socialist, communist, or anarchist institutions make little to no appearance in Attack on Titan. These philosophies are fundamentally rejected by the assumptions of the fascist worldview, and therefore could not function in a world predicated on the fascist understanding. And while one could attempt to make the argument that Attack on Titan does not embody a full-fledged fascist philosophy, but only embodies some aspects, some building blocks of fascism, the ultimate thesis being a call to action, a call to violent action no less, refutes that argument on the most fundamental level. So where do we go from here? Well, at this point, we've demonstrated that within Attack on Titan there is propaganda, of the Nazi variety even. Now whether or not that was actively thought out and intentional is certainly up for debate, but we've demonstrated its existence. We then went on to demonstrate that Attack on Titan adheres most closely to fascist philosophy and fascist worldview, citing numerous fascist thinkers and a couple of historical analytics along the way to help us out. So we've done a fair amount to demonstrate which opinions and which arguments are credible within the discourse, at least in regards to the question of fascism surrounding Attack on Titan. And we've answered the first half of our Quora Friends question in the hopes that our little question-asking game will help us overall analyze the series and talk about the discourse in a more broad sense. However, I'm sure that many of you have already picked up on a new dissonance that our investigation has brought up. And that dissonance surrounds the fact that Attack on Titan does seemingly offer up some commentary and confrontation against fascism. How can Attack on Titan both embody a core fascist philosophy and worldview, but also seemingly reject the idea of fascism? Fundamentally, the answer to that question lies in the fact that Attack on Titan does not understand what fascism is, at least not in its entirety. In Attack on Titan, fascism is the end result manifestation of a fascist movement. Floke and Erwin are both clear examples of fascism, but again, they're only presented as such when they are in their most mature state. Now, this is a highly common conception of fascism, and contributes very deeply to a broader misunderstanding of fascism in general, as fascism as a whole is often only understood as such when a fascist movement has not only seized power, but then used power to do some sort of horrific violence. And it is in this way that I believe Attack on Titan is capable of overlooking its own fascism. Both the author and the series are capable of holding this dissonance together because they don't understand the true nature of what they're commenting on. Thus, Attack on Titan can contain within it all of the underpinnings, building blocks, and assumptions required to construct fascist philosophy without viewing these things as fascist. Because, in Attack on Titan's understanding, fascism is when Floke shoots people. It's when Erwin does the rumbling. The philosophical and political assumptions that these acts are predicated on go by the wayside, and are not roped into Attack on Titan's commentary on fascism. And thus, what might seemingly be a weak aspect of the case that Attack on Titan embodies a fascist worldview is actually a byproduct of Attack on Titan embodying that worldview while simultaneously not understanding it. And as you can see now, it's at this point the discussion of the discourse around Attack on Titan begins to bleed into the work itself. Because as a community, as a group of people, we, the collective viewership, are often equally as ill-equipped to understand or analyze fascism. And we, like Isayama, often fail to accurately be able to discuss fascism because we fail to understand it. But we've only answered half the question, and so we're going to kick in the clutch and shift gears here to the second half of our Quora Friends question as we enter part 3 of the video. So here we go, part 3, that old dead horsey dude. Saka no Ui no Kumo is a television series that aired from 2009 to 2011. Based on the 1968 novel of the same name by Ryotaro Shiba, the series was produced by NHK, the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation. The series is broadly about the evolution of Meiji Japan and the birth of the Japanese Empire, and as you might imagine, its climax is during the Russo-Japanese War. Now, the series follows three main characters: Akiyama Yoshifuru, Akiyama Senyuki, and Makoto Shiki, the author and poet. Now, Saka no Ui no Kumo is a shameless historical revisionist piece of propaganda. It is also rather racist towards Chinese people in a way that might be a little bit complicated to understand if you don't have a basic familiarity with Western imperialism in China and Japan. But, for example, apart from China being depicted as literally, in fact, covered in shit, the Japanese are always juxtaposed against their Chinese counterparts and presented as being better at being Western, or being better at being white, for lack of a better word. They speak English well, whereas their Chinese counterparts speak it poorly. The Japanese have mastered the Western way of dress, while the Chinese are characterized by what is presented as a backwards traditionalist style. And of course, the Japanese, because they are so intelligent, through diligent study have mastered the Western art of warfare and technology. Whereas the Chinese are dirty, opium-smoking, and disorganized, incapable of mastering modern naval combat. Like most pieces of revisionist history, the show has a serious problem juggling Japanese imperial ambitions and trying to present Japanese military expeditions, such as the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, as benevolent actions designed to help lift up fellow Asians. And for example, in the Boxer Rebellion, the Japanese are clearly depicted as compassionate, whereas the Russians mercilessly slaughter innocent civilians. This stands in stark contrast to the fact that the Japanese were part to numerous massacres and were identified alongside the Russians and Germans as some of the worst offenders. Sake no Ue no Kumo also has a very large focus on the idea of self-reliance. The characters themselves are supposed to personify this trait, and it is supposed to be reflective of Japanese self-reliance, building up the nation to be a modern industrial power, and for example, no longer having to rely on the purchasing of Western battleships. This strong theme of self-reliance, however, clearly runs in contradiction to occupations and resource extraction from Korea and Manchuria. The subjugation of other Asian peoples does not particularly jive well with the idea of doing it all yourself. And so, Sake no Ui no Kumo will conveniently overlook things like the Port Arthur massacre of the First Sino-Japanese War, while presenting Japan as the underdog who refuses to be a victim of Western imperialism. The series very strongly makes the point that Japan definitely did all this industrialization by itself without being a manipulative colonialist power, and if it did, it was okay because that's what everyone else was doing at the time, but also, bro, we had to because we were totally just defending ourselves and it was the only way to not get conquered by Russia, and also, hey, even if we did those things, it wasn't that bad anyhow. But while the series definitively says all these things, I don't think that making excuses for or feeling good about Japanese imperialism and colonialism is the only reason why the book was written, and I certainly don't believe it's the only reason why a work like this would see widespread adoption not only at the time it was released, but at the time it was remade into a television series. The book and television show both characterize the military as something glorifying. Military service is presented as heroic and aspirational, and something that is quintessential to the building of the stability of Japan. The story also has a big focus on doing it yourself, making the argument that Japan shouldn't be reliant on external powers for its own defense. And conveniently, the work harkens back to a time that isn't stained by the horrific war crimes of World War II. Now, like I said, the novel came out in 1968, and it's around this time period and within the preceding decade that the relationship between the United States and Japan moves away from one where the United States is dictating and running Japanese internal affairs towards one of Japanese autonomy. Now, as the Japanese are gaining greater self-autonomy, there are a lot of things going on peripherally, and there are a lot of things on the international stage that are going to generate anxiety. It's a very complex time period, so I think it's not difficult to understand why a work like this would be popularly well received at the time. And so, fast forwarding to 2009, I think we can see why this series might have been relevant again in the Japanese mindset, and why people might have been receptive to a television remake. If you're an old person like me, you may recall the Bush administration, and you may recall a pretty pivotal event in modern American history that took place in early September of Bush's first year in office. After 2001, the global stage changed quite a lot, and the United States incorporated North Korea into its axis of evil. This time period saw not only the entrance of North Korea onto the global stage as a nuclear power, but the escalation of missile tests off the coast of Japan, and the end of the South Korean Sunshine Policy, which was not rebooted until 2017. So again, I would argue that it's not entirely mysterious why a series like this would find purchase in Japan at this time. But obviously that's only a portion of the story here. If geopolitical and historical anxieties are why revisionist history are appealing, then we probably have to say a little bit more about the objective of revisionism. And to do so, I'd like to take a look at a couple excerpts from a work called Forgiving the Culprits, Japanese Historical Revisionism in a Post-War Context, by In-Yu Oh and Douglas Ishiwara Gerbic. The authors write that the underlying objective of historical revisionism is to blur the distinct line that exists between the victims and the aggressors. By depicting Japanese war criminals as victims of Western imperialism, revisionists want their schoolchildren to memorize pre-war Japan as a heroic nation that struggled to free its Asian neighbors from Western aggression. The authors further write that the movement towards historical and constitutional revisionism is an attempt to recover the Japanese pre-war identity as a normal international citizen who has the capacity to invade other Asian countries for the purpose of defending Japan itself. Moreover, aggression is justified to defend all of East Asia under the banner of Japanese nationalism. Not unlike the pre-war era, this banner of nationalism necessitates alliances with Western powers, notably the United States. In this sense, post-war revisionism immediately contradicts itself. To protect Asia from Western imperialism, Japan aligns with the West. After all, it is not contradictory at all. From the beginning, Japan wanted to be another Western power. These descriptions perfectly encapsulate Sake no Ue no Kumo, and they provide a great deal of insight not only to the show, but into the real-world Japan that the story is received by. After all, the Constitution of Japan is a rather large document, with each section having several subsections, typically. At least when I view it here on japan.kentai.go.jp/Constitution and Government of Japan, however, Chapter 2 only has one section, Renunciation of War, which is blocked out in Article 9, and it reads as follows. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as all other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. At this point, I don't think it's difficult to see where historical revisionists stand when it comes to reinterpretations of the Japanese Constitution, expansion of the Japanese self-defense forces, and the highly contentious reimagining or reworking of Article 9 that comes along with all of this. I also don't think it's particularly mysterious where Attack on Titan's commentary falls in this discourse. After all, some of the first conversations we encounter in the opening of the manga involve the readiness of self-defense forces, how a nation allocates funds on its military and defense, and the argument around the need for constant readiness against the ever-looming threat of potential foes. So why is any of this important? Why spend so much time on J-dramas and events surrounding the development of modern Japan? Well, it's important because not only do we need to understand the context of the world that Isayama, the author, grew up in, but we also need to understand the context in which Akiyama Yoshifuru is being deployed, not only to Isayama or by Isayama, but to Japanese society and the world at large by revisionist media like Sake no Ue no Kumo. Because if we fail to understand Yoshifuru as a figure of revisionist history, and as a character that's deployed to bolster a revisionist narrative, We're not able to really fully understand the historical figure himself and his place in Japan, and we're not really able to understand Pixis, his Attack on Titan counterpart. After all, unlike Erwin Rommel, Akiyama did not escape the eye of the internet or the eye of observers of Attack on Titan. And outside of the general thematics of the show itself, criticism of his appearance has been some of the most heated. So again, it's very important for our purposes to understand how Isayama understands Akiyama Yoshifuru. After watching the series, I deeply believe that it was very influential on Attack on Titan, not just in terms of visual aspects, but in terms of basic character aspects as well. For example, the 3-character main cast maps over nicely with Sake no Ui no Kumo. We can also see some basic similarities with the deployment of the C, from the way it's used in language to what it represents to the characters themselves. There is this particular scene portraying the Imperial threat to Japan that I thought had quite a lot of resemblance to various scenes in Attack on Titan. And there are, perhaps even more obviously, the battleships themselves, some of the scenes of which and the construction of which seem to be the direct template for many in Attack on Titan. And it has been pointed out by more than one observer that the Battle of Fort Salda looks a lot like the Battle of Port Arthur. Additionally, we can see the same similarity with the anti-Titan artillery and the large caliber artillery deployed in Sake no Ui no Kumo. And certain lines like this throwing rocks from above, which is what the commander of Japanese forces argues they'll be able to do in a metaphorical sense once they seize Hill 203, which overlooks Port Arthur, again almost seem like they could have been taken directly from and inspired directly by Sake no Kumo, when extraordinarily similar actions appear in Attack on Titan. Like I said, it's not purely visual similarities as well, and one of several similarities is both Attack on Titan and Sake no Ui no Kumo are able to deploy and depict violence as something tragic and horrifying, while also being something glorifying and necessary. Additionally, Sake no Ui no Kumo and Attack on Titan are both able to show how conflict affects both sides, and how suffering can deeply impact two different groups. A great example of this is the love story between a young Japanese officer and his Russian fiancée. He is torn between Russia, the country where he has learned about the Navy and studied for many years, and Japan, his home country, and ultimately he ends up dying fighting against one of his best friends, a Russian man in the Russian Navy. At his funeral, he's treated to the same honors as any Russian sailor, and is grieved over by his dear friend. This bears striking similarity to me to so many of the scenes that people point to in Attack on Titan that depict the humanity that exists between various groups in spite of their conflicts. However, it again highlights the similarity between Sake no Ui no Kumo and Attack on Titan, in that they can both depict this while simultaneously glorifying conflict and arguing for its necessity. It's hard for me to think of a more likely influence for so many aspects of Attack on Titan. Series 0 dropped in 2006, so in 2009, when Isayama was beginning to release his first editions of what had become Attack on Titan, it would be releasing alongside Sake no Ui no Kumo. Additionally, Sake no Ui no Kumo had been in the making for quite some time, with the rights being acquired in 2001, the television series wrapping up around the time the 30th chapter of the manga would drop. And Sake no Ui no Kumo the book had been in public consciousness for decades, as it was Shiba's second most popular work, selling over 14 million copies in Japanese alone, making revisionist historical fiction arguably the most likely way anybody would encounter Akiyama Yoshifuru. So I realize I've presented a lot in kind of rapid succession, so in an attempt to make my argument a little bit clearer, I'd like us to take a somewhat in-depth look at the writings of historian Rodham Nauer, author of Time to Remember, Time to Forget, The Battle of Tsushima in Japanese Collective Memory Since 1905. And the author writes of the Battle of Tsushima that the most important cultural reference to the battle in this new era, however, appeared in written form, entitled Sake no Ui no Kumo, Clouds Above the Hill. One element in the book's success was undoubtedly the identity of its novelist, Shiba Ryutaria, Japan's most prominent and popular author of historical fiction to this very day. But additionally, crucial elements were its content and context. During the period when the Japanese public began to feel confident enough to re-examine its sour experiences during the so-called 15 Years' War, Sake no Ui no Kumo told the story of a just war, and of patriotic officers, Epitomizing Shiba's passion for the Bushido values of patriotism, loyalty, and selflessness, Shiba's multi-volume epic triggered a revival of public interest in Tsushima. Togo, for example, was a topic of no fewer than 3 new biographies published within 4 years of each other. The same year in which Shiba's final volume appeared also witnessed the publication of Yoshimura Akira's Umi no Shigeki, historical drama of the sea. In the past 2 decades, the most notable literary contribution to the battle's commemoration has been in the form of manga. A semi-graphic novel of this genre is the work of illustrator Ueda Shin and writer Takanuki Nobuhiro, Jitsuroku Nihon Kai Kensen, the record of the naval battle of Tsushima, which serialized in 2000. A year later, Egawa Tatsua's Nichiro Senso Monogatari, A Tale of the Russo-Japanese War, became a hit. By all accounts, the success of both works amplified the popularity of Sake no Ue no Kumo among a new and younger audience. Another indication of popularity was the city of Matsuyama's decision to open a museum commemorating the novel, the Sake no Ue no Kumo Museum. A few years later, and 4 decades after its initial publication, Shiba's novel received a second peek in an adapted visual form, airing between 2009 and 2011, and culminating in a final episode entitled The Battle of Tsushima, Nihon Kai Kaisen. This 13-episode production was the most expensive and most elaborate period drama NHK had ever produced. Its popularity was high as well, reaching an average viewership rating of no less than 19.6% of the total viewership in 2 of its episodes. The climax of this post-war fascination with the battle occurred around its centenary in 2005. By then, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force had established the Russo-Japanese War as an ethical epitome of the defense role this service is expected to fulfill. The same year saw the homecoming of the Z flag, which Togo had hoisted aboard his flagship, Misaka. As the centenary celebrations of the battle approached, the Marine Society, which inherited the flag, agreed to lend it permanently to the Togo Shrine. Since its retrieval, the flag has been turned into a major symbol of the shrine, and copies are its best-selling memorabilia. The Z flag eventually made it back to the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, when the guided missile destroyer Chokai hoisted it during a Japanese joint military training drill in October 2011. Now, the author highlights a quotation from a memorial erected in memory of the Battle of Tsushima, and I'd like to finish this out by reading for you from that section. The memorial stated that present-day Japan has lost its self-confidence, and as the author notes, accordingly, national pride could be fostered by handing on the inheritance of the 27th of May and engraving it in the hearts of the Japanese people. Only then will our country, Nippon, be able to recover its great hopes and dreams. Our committee continues to plead for a return to the old Japan and considers this an opportunity to reassert Bushido Japan, genuine nationalism, and the creation of a proud Japan as objectives for future generations. So while I realize that's a lot of information at once, I hope this again will help us to contextualize Attack on Titan and the deployment of Akiyama Yoshifuru by Isayama. And I hope it will demonstrate that Attack on Titan and this discussion in general is actually part of a much larger and much broader trend in Japanese society, and shouldn't be looked at as something unique, but rather part of a developing tradition within revisionism to make use of newer medias often adopted by younger people to push the same revisionist narratives that have existed since the end of the war and whose roots extend even prior to it. Because all of this is a part of something much larger, and in many ways it involves all of Japan's struggle to grapple with its past and to grapple with moving forward in its future. At this point, hopefully everyone doesn't feel too thoroughly beaten over the head with context, because I think it's time for us to finally talk about Akiyama Yoshifuru himself. So, who is Akiyama Yoshifuru, and what was the world he lived in like? Akiyama Yoshifuru would spend the majority of his life pursuing a military career, though throughout his many years he would also have an intersection with education, both prior to joining the military and upon his retirement. Akiyama was both born in the shadow of Matsuyama Castle and in the shadow of the former world that Japan had occupied. After all, it had only been a few years prior in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry had used the persuasive art of black powder to open up Japan's ports fully to the first time in several hundred years to the world. Being from a lower-class family of former samurai, Akiyama, like many young men in Japan, was forced to find a career and try to make a life for himself in the changing world he was growing up in. He pursued an education and even teaching briefly as a young man, but in 1877 his direction and career shifted towards the military. And ultimately, he would graduate from the military academy 2 years later as a second lieutenant in the cavalry. As a young cavalry officer, Akiyama spent time in France, learning the French way of cavalry warfare, and he would take this experience back to Japan and incorporate it into his own writings and his own tactical developments. Akiyama Yoshifuru's initial experience with combat came during the First Sino-Japanese War, where he was attached to the Imperial Japanese Army's 1st Division. This war is largely about Japan trying to assert itself as an imperial power, as opposed to a subordinate of imperial powers. But like the Russo-Japanese War, it also has much to do with who has control over Korea and large parts of northern China. Ultimately, the war is a rather sweeping victory for the Japanese. However, the same Western powers the Japanese were seeking to become equals with in the international imperial and colonial order would be responsible for denying Japan its imperial gains. The triple intervention of Russia, France, and Germany not only denied Japan much of their gains, but it also teed off much of the future conflict between Japan and Russia that would culminate in the Russo-Japanese War. The First Sino-Japanese War isn't the last time these powers brushed up against each other before the Russo-Japanese War itself. And along with Japanese forces, Akiyama Yoshifuru would again return to combat when he was deployed to suppress the Boxer Rebellion as part of Japan's contribution to the international coalition sent to China. After the Boxer Rebellion, Akiyama spent a brief time with the garrison in China. However, it was only a few years later that the largest conflict he would participate in would kick off, the Russo-Japanese War. Now, the Russo-Japanese War is rather fascinating, and if you have time to go look it up on your own, I would highly suggest you do so. However, for our purposes and understanding Akiyama, we're just going to focus on what they were fighting over, which is largely Korea and parts of northern China. Because at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese win, and as a prize, they get Korea. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt from the United States oversees the treaty signed at Portsmouth. And this international status of protector over Korea and occupation and domination of Korean territory is then enforced internationally. And so for a little context, I thought I'd read for you from Alexis Duden's Japan's Colonization of Korea, Discourse and Power. In the summer of 1907, the world declared Korea illegal. The previous autumn, Emperor Kojong of Korea sent 3 representatives on his behalf to the Second International Conference on Peace at The Hague. Their mission was to register the emperor's protest against Japan's 1905 protectorate agreement over Korea. According to the well-known account of their travels over land in Europe, Yi Sang-sol, Yi Jun, and Yi Yuizhong reached the Netherlands in late June of 1907, during the second week of the conference. They carried a letter from the emperor detailing the invalidity of the protectorate and demanding international condemnation of Japan. Although the 3 young men appealed to diplomats from countries that had long-standing relations with Korea, none except the Russian envoy gave them more than a passing notice. On arrival at The Hague, the Korean emissaries confronted a belief system to which even the Russians had acquiesced. According to the terms of international law, the same ones used to script the conference at The Hague and legitimate the participant states, the Koreans could not legally attend the forum. The Portsmouth Treaty of 1905 secured peace between Japan and Russia, granted Japan the privilege to protect its interest in Korea, and garnered the Nobel Peace Prize for President Theodore Roosevelt, who orchestrated the negotiations. Shortly thereafter, the Second Japan-Korea Agreement named Korea a protectorate and gave international legal precedence to Japan's control over Korea's foreign affairs. As a result, Koreans could not conduct their own foreign relations. Instead, all of Korea's foreign affairs would be conducted from Tokyo. According to international law, without Japan, Korea no longer existed in relation to the rest of the world. Akiyama Yoshifuru himself was a member of the Japanese delegation and was present for these events at The Hague. Akiyama would go on to serve in a variety of capacities in the military and ultimately be appointed the commander of the Korean garrison forces for the tenure of 1 year. Upon returning home, his military career wound down, and he was eventually appointed to a principalship of the then Hokyuyo Private Junior High School. In his later years, he had a hand in authoring and publishing a book called Continental Romance. and he ultimately passed away in 1930 due to complications from illness and alcohol consumption. So now that we know a little bit more about Akiyama Yoshifuru, we're going to need to discuss how he's presented, both on Wikipedia and in Attack on Titan. And there's two reasons for this. Number one being the information around him on Wikipedia is rather suspect. Now, I realize that Wikipedia already receives a large amount of criticisms, so I don't think most people will be unfamiliar with what I'm about to put forward here. And it's probably best for us to start with the English Wikipedia, so let's take a look at that one. Right off the bat, we'll notice that Wikipedia is actually giving its own warning about the article, and it's asking for additional citations for verification as of October 2014, and stating that the tone or style may not reflect the encyclopedic tone used on Wikipedia as of June 2022. Now, I think we're going to see that both of these observations are not only correct, but perhaps slight understatements. When we go to the references section, you'll notice there are two books listed as references. One by Trevor N. Dupree, being the Encyclopedia of Military Biography, and the other by Hisashi Oide, being Yoshifuru Akiyama, Kibo's most important figure, or individual, at least according to Google Translate. Now, what's particularly interesting about this first source is while the information is quite limited and short, not all of the information makes it from the source to the Wikipedia article. Notably, the source mentions him as being deployed during the capture of Port Arthur in the First Sino-Japanese War, whereas the Wikipedia article lacks this. And it harkens back to Saki no Umi no Kumo leaving out discussion of crimes committed at Port Arthur during the First Sino-Japanese War, as we saw earlier. The second source listed, however, is highly suspect. But to understand why, we're going to have to briefly talk about the history of Channel Sakura. What is Channel Sakura, you ask? Well, I'm going to be quoting from a doctoral dissertation called Finding Meaning Online, Grassroots Media and Conservative Activism in Japan, by Jeffrey James Hall. And in his dissertation, Hall writes, "The story of Channel Sakura's creation cannot be told without first telling the story of its three founding leaders, Tagada Takeo, Matsura Yoshiko, and Mizushima Satoru. Tagada Takeo was a fighter pilot in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service during World War II. He served from 1935 to 1945, flying and fighting over China, Burma, and Formosa. The defining experience of his military career began in 1944, when he became a flight instructor for the young pilots who were to serve in the special attack units. His life was spared when a radio broadcast the following day announced that Japan had surrendered and the war had come to an end. In the early post-war years, Tagada became a leader of a right-wing group known as the Nihon Kakume Kikuhata Doshinkai. Writing in 1950, Nobutaka Ike of Stanford University described the Kikuhata Doshikai as the National Socialists of Japan, a fiercely anti-communist organization following an ideology that closely resembled the views of German Nazism. Matsura Yoshiko had a very different background. As the author writes, Matsura Yoshiko was born in Tokyo in 1948, growing up in post-war Japan. Her involvement in conservative politics began in the late 60s, during her years as a student at Tokyo Keisai Gakuen Junior College. Matsura was also a secretary for Tate no Kai, a private nationalist militia founded by author Mishima Yukio. Her fiancé and future husband was Mochimaru Hiroyoshi, a student leader of Tate no Kai. Matsura successfully ran for office in 2003 as an independent candidate and became an assemblywoman for Tokyo's Tsunagami ward. Her campaigning and political activities focused on promoting patriotic education. She supported Tsunagami Ward's 2005 decision to adopt Sakurakai's history textbook in its junior high schools, an event that has been described as Sakurakai's most notable success. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Sakurakai, Sakurakai is the shorthand for the Society for Historical Textbook Reform, and the revisionist textbook that they've attempted to proliferate. Her website profile lists Matsumura as a leader of the Tokyo branch of Nippon Kaigi, an organizer of the Association of Regional Lawmakers opposing the installation of comfort women statues, and as a president of the Association of Local Lawmakers who protect Tsushima. Matsura and Tagada Takeo met for the first time in 2000. Tagada told her about his wish to make a film preserving the history of the kamikaze pilots in order to teach the younger generations about their sacrifice. He asked for her help in putting the project together, and she agreed. And this leads us to the introduction of our third character instrumental in the founding of Channel Sakura. As the author notes, lacking the necessary skills to make such a film, they searched for a director. Yamamoto Takuma, president of the Kaikosha and vice chairman of the Nippon Kagi, and Kase Hideki, Society for the Dissemination of Historical Fact, introduced them to Mizushima Satoru, an experienced director and screenwriter. A committee was formed to support the creation of the kamikaze film. It included a panel of advisors consisting mainly of conservative academics, activists, war veterans, and business leaders. The film was paid for through a fundraising campaign aimed at war veterans. They successfully completed a documentary film in 2001, Kamikaze Testimony. Even if the country is ruined, it shall not perish. It aired late at night on Fuji TV on August 16th, 2001. Ooh, wow, pretty heavy stuff, huh? But we're not at the end yet, and for our purposes, the most important part is yet to come. The author continues that Channel Sakura was officially launched on August 15th, 2004, with Mizushima Satoru as its president. As the anniversary of Japan's defeat in World War II, it was a symbolic date. A flyer announced its creation, declaring that the post-war Japan would change. The flyer's description of the program introduced a collective experience in which viewers, together with Channel Sakura, would work to preserve and promote traditional culture. Programs would also look back at the history of our country and help us rediscover the true spirit of Japan. So now that we're familiar with what Channel Sakura is and the history of the channel and its founders, we can look at the list of the 87 key supporters. And I would direct your attention to name number 50 on that list, Takashiro Hajime, CEO of Kojinsha Publishing Company. And it's at this point you have probably surmised who the publisher of our second book on the reference list is. And you will also probably not be surprised with who Tageda's publisher of choice is. Additionally, there shouldn't be very much surprise when the text reads like this. Well, that was a rabbit hole and a half, wasn't it? But I think we've figured out why the English portion of the Wikipedia on Akiyama Yoshifuru is maybe not something you'd want to cite in your sources section. But a lot of this is taken from the Japanese Wikipedia itself, so I think it might help us to take a quick look at that as well. Now, the Japanese wiki has its own little pre-warning here that we can read. It says the sources remain unclear due to insufficient footnote references. And while I agree this is probably true, I don't think that this entirely sums up all the problems we're going to encounter here in a minute. We will note that the Japanese section does have a bit more going on for it. We got some footnotes, we got a fair amount of sources here, some of which appear to be actual Japanese army documents, and then we have a bit wider of a reference section. Now, since we've already spent a lot of time on this, I'm going to try to make things a little bit simpler by breaking up their sources and references into what I think are the four basic categories they fall into. First off, we're going to have things like these various gazettes and publications that are historical documents, and they can verify things like chronology, maybe like where he was at a certain time, or what rank he was in a certain year. Secondly, something we see used quite a lot in these sources and references is what I would kind of refer to more as stories. These are largely anecdotal and seem to have been written by people who were close to him or peripherally near him after his death. Third up, we'd have things that I would consider to be relatively disconnected from historical fact, like for example excerpts from Sakano Uenokumo, but also works like our previously cited military revisionist history. But then we also have things like blogs that don't really cite any sources and dead links. And the fourth and last category that our resources and sources are likely to fall into is historical texts of some sorts, like military encyclopedias, kind of similar to the military encyclopedia that we saw on the English Wikipedia side. So now that we have a decent idea of how the sources are broken down, let's break down the Wikipedia article itself. And broadly, I would say it can be split into two categories: Akiyama's time in the military and Akiyama's time in education. Now, right off the bat, you should probably be able to detect what the discrepancy is here. The overwhelming majority of the easily verifiable, encyclopedically referenceable information concerns his life in the military. However, the time and space dedicated to his life in the military is incredibly small in the Wikipedia article, given time dedicated to him as an educator. I struggled to find an analog for this, but imagine if you skipped over Mike Tyson's boxing career and wrote several paragraphs about his time in the movies. And there are some pretty substantial claims being made about his time as an educator. If you read this, you would take away the idea that Akiyama Yoshifuru not only shaped the pre-war Japanese education system, but still continues to shape it until this day. This, however, would be inaccurate, and honestly you'd be kinda hard-pressed to find this guy's name in any Japanese educational documents, or documents that refer to any Japanese educators outside of his own Wikipedia page. For example, he does not appear in the Japanese Wikipedia's section about Japanese education, nor does he appear in the section about the history of education. Notably, all the Japanese documents alleged here to contain some reference to him do not. Akiyama does appear to be remembered and even referenced by the school that he was formerly principal of, though the school has changed names since his time. He even appears in the modern principal's speech, which is interesting if you want to read it. However, when we go to nearby Matsuyama Miyami High School, no mention of Akiyama can be found. And it's not just the extreme amounts of embellishment around his educational career too. There's lots of just bad information within the Wikipedia page, and plenty of references that literally just come from Sakano Uenokumo. I would like to note that I'm not the only one to observe this, and additionally most of the contributions to the education section seem to have been made by a Wikipedian who is no longer active to correct, amend, or offer additional citation. But perhaps what is both most troubling and what should be most obvious about both Wikipedia pages is not the obfuscation of just his career in the military in favor of a highly embellished and somewhat mythologized career in education, but what seems a very obvious attempt to downplay his time in Korea and the role he played in solidifying Japanese colonial rule of the Korean nation. I have to say that it's actually rather fitting that Akiyama Yoshifuru was a cavalry commander, because his Wikipedia page is absolute horseshit. However, I hope I've driven home the point, not only that this wiki is not something that you can use to get a realistic or accurate picture of Akiyama Yoshifuru, but I also hope to have demonstrated that Akiyama's legacy is the victim of a very serious campaign of bleaching, meticulously removing the stains so that they can be re-dyed with new color that would be more appealing to a modern generation. And this is all part of a much larger concerted effort in the evolution of revisionism and right-wing politics in Japan in general. So while I felt it was worth taking a closer look at the educational aspects of Akiyama Yoshifuru, as you may have already realized, that is vastly irrelevant, because within Attack on Titan, Yoshifuru is not deployed as an educator. He doesn't appear as a teacher, and he doesn't appear as a retired military official who's now in the occupation of a principal or something. He is deployed as a military leader, a commander. This is both the aspect of his own real-world legacy that he is embodying, and how we as the audience are meant to interact with and experience him. So much in the same way that discussion around Akiyama in the Wikipedia is heavily prefaced and put forward as a method for obfuscating from his life as a military figure, within discussion around Attack on Titan, discussion of Akiyama as an educational figure is deployed in nearly the exact same way. It's designed to take us away from what actually matters and how the character is actually being deployed within the manga and anime. So, wow. It turned out there was a whole heck of a lot to say about the second half of our Korra Friends question. I hope I wasn't too rambly and didn't stray too far from the point. I did feel that a lot of context really was required here to get the full picture with Akiyama Yoshifuru, because so much of his story exists outside of Attack on Titan as well. Unfortunately, I feel like there's still a little bit left to cover, and so before we get into our last part, we're going to have to shift gears yet again and enter part 4 of the video. So here we go, part 4, the Eldia of our world. The story of Eldia and the Eldian people has been widely discussed by the Attack on Titan viewership, and debate around the message that's supposed to be derived from and the analogs being used in telling the Eldian story are often points of huge contention within the fandom. Many people will point to very overt surface symbology like the armbands or ghettoization, which is clearly reminiscent of German mistreatment of Jews, and claim that this is proof that the story of the Eldians and their relationship with Marley is one meant to expose why it's wrong to treat people in the way the Eldians are currently being treated in Marley. However, upon further examining this idea, it seems like a very strange analogy. After all, there never was a great imperial colonial Jewish empire that ruled the world and mistreated numerous other peoples. The map of the world itself makes us think of the infamous Nazi Madagascar plan to a certain degree, but what about the Eldian king's renunciation of war? That's an odd little element, right? And so we're left with an awkward and perplexing analog for anything in the real world. Or are we? Because I can already hear the cries from the comments section. Come on, bro. What don't you get? Marley is the Nazis. Just look at the helmets. This is clearly a story about why we shouldn't be like the Nazis. So I'd like us to start by coming at it from a little bit of a different angle. What is the story of the Eldian Empire, anyhow? Well, we know the genesis of the story is based on sort of a hyper-reductive conflict that's meant to mirror the Roman Empire and the various Germanic tribes it warred against. And for the Eldians, while they are militarily powerful, they don't seem to reach their full height until Ymir comes into contact with the Titan powers, and her Titan powers are used by King Fritz. The power of the Titans builds and forges the Eldian Empire, which is an aggressive warring empire that engages in brutal colonial policy. There is eventually a severe defeat of the Eldian imperial forces, and the king of the Eldians withdraws many, but not all Eldians, to the island of Paradis, and declares that they will no longer engage in war. And within the story, Eldians trapped on the continent are subjected to a variety of abuses as new powers rise to take over the former Eldian Empire. Now, in isolation, this story might actually sound a little bit familiar to you, and that's because it shares a bit of similarity with a real-world story. Because there is a place in our world in which numerous warring groups that ultimately came down to two sides that fought a pivotal battle, and who, more or less unified under a single front, experienced the influx of a new type of power, a titanic type of power even, that of industrialization, went on to form a vast imperial colonial empire that committed a great deal of atrocities across a huge portion of the world, before its ultimate defeat and decision to renounce war forever. And that place, of course, would be Japan. This is, after all, the story of unification after the Battle of Sekigahara under the Tokugawa regime, the rise of the Meiji period in the Japanese Empire, the influx of industrialization, and then the series of imperial and colonial wars that they conducted before their ultimate defeat at the end of the Second World War, at which point Japan renounced war forever. And our little parallels don't end here. During the decades of Japanese settler colonialism, millions of Japanese had left their homeland for various destinations all across Asia. And what happened to these people after the war is, for our purposes, very much worth looking into. When talking about the fate of Japanese settlers after the war, author Jia Kai-shing cites Lori Watts, saying, "The unmaking of empires everywhere is a complex process, and the human remnants of Japan's empire, those who were moved and those who were left behind, served as sites of negotiation for the process of disengagement from empire and the creation of new national identities." And while this process didn't have the devastating cost in life of the Japanese policies in Asia, it was certainly not a simplistic nor a pretty process. Shing's article, Homeward Bound, the Post-War Repatriation of Japanese Civilians in Shanghai, 1945 through 1948, demonstrates one example in this process that I think for our purposes is particularly worth taking a look at. As the author writes, August 14, 1945, 14-year-old Kageyama Tetsu was working at the Zhanyang shipyard on the outskirts of Shanghai. Since the early stage of the war, it was placed under control of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Kageyama and his classmates at the Shanghai Japanese Middle School were mobilized to join the Working Hard for the Nation student squad, serving the Japanese military. Shortly before noon, much earlier than usual, Kageyama's team was dismissed and ordered to go home. 24 hours later, the entire Kageyama family gathered in their living room. They heard the voice of the emperor communicating for the first time with his people at home and throughout the empire. The war was over, and Japan had lost. His family life in Shanghai, where he was born and raised, where his father had been working as a teacher for 35 years, was coming to an end. Although his family managed to remain in Shanghai for 3 more years, over 98% of the Japanese population in the city at the end of the war were repatriated by the summer of 1946. While this initial intro into the life of a particular Japanese settler family may not appear to share parallels with Attack on Titan, It's when we get a little bit deeper into what occurred in Shanghai that I think those parallels become undeniable. Continuing on, the author writes, on September 16th, the TFA headquarters ordered all Japanese civilians outside the Hongqiu area to relocate within 5 days. More detailed instructions on relocation soon followed as a part of the Rules for Managing and Organizing Japanese Nationals, announced on September 24th, which used for the first time the term Japanese Nationals Concentration Zone. For those who lived outside the concentration zone, an acute challenge was now to find accommodation for their entire family in the assigned area. Kagayama Tetsu's family's new residence was on the second and third floors of a small 3-storied warehouse owned by a Japanese friend who ran a military supply store. Writing further, Shang describes that, in the concentration zone, Japanese civilians were subject to rigorous regulations. They were not allowed to leave their residence between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Anyone who went out had to wear an armband with the characters Richao, meaning Japanese national. Leaving the concentration zone was of course strictly prohibited without special permission. By January 1946, the SJNMO had issued only 169 such permissions. I think now we can see how these might be more definitive and direct parallels to the story we're seeing in Attack on Titan than some of the others that have been put forward in previous discourse. Within Attack on Titan, we hear tell that the fate of Eldians outside of Marley is in many cases actually worse than the fate of Eldians within Marley. And it's within this that I again think we can see some real-world historical parallels. As mentioned earlier, millions of Japanese colonists would leave over a period of decades, with a variety of different destinations, one of those being Manchuria and the puppet state of Manchukuo, where the Japanese government was heavily encouraging immigration, colonization, and agriculture. In his article, What Happened to the Settlers the Japanese Army Abandoned in China, Michael Meyer notes that, although they made up only 17% of the 1.5 million Japanese living in the puppet state Manchukuo, settlers accounted for nearly half of its death toll. They had been enticed there by the Millions to Manchuria campaign begun in 1936. When Japan's farms faced stagnation amid a nationwide recession in part due to the American embargo. Go, go, and colonize the continent, propaganda posters urged Japanese. A new land awaits the village youth. This migratory process that so often resulted in death and tragedy had an enormous grassroots element, with organizers oftentimes mobilizing small villages. In their article about modern research into Manchurian colonization, reporter Tagake Tamanaga cites historian and researcher Takanori Tetsuka's analysis of diaries written by the 36-year-old mayor of Kawano village. Kurumizawa, who became Kawano mayor at age 36, played a significant role in organizing and sending a group of 95 villagers to Manchuria in 1944. However, by May 1945, the Japanese military had decided to abandon 3/4 of Manchuria, and the bulk of the Kwantung Army relocated to southern fronts in what had now become World War II. The Army's depleted ranks were replenished by drafting male settlers between 18 and 45. After the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and Japan's surrender in World War II in August 1945, most of the settlers from Kurumizawa's village committed mass suicide. In all, 73 of them, mostly women and children, died, and Kurumizawa killed himself the following year. The final page of Kurumizawa's diary is missing, but the newspaper carried his last words, which also became recognized in his will. I am sorry for driving agricultural immigrants into such miserable conditions. Regrettably, I cannot take care of them anymore. Please make my property and house available for them. And even for those settlers who did not die in Manchuria, repatriation itself was often extraordinarily hard, and in awaiting the repatriation process, they were often subjected to rather terrifying conditions. Writing on this topic in their essay, The Question of Japaneseness, Repatriation and Guilt in Post-War Japan, author Kilby Hammond cites the story of a young woman's experience not only in Manchuria, but dealing with her repatriation back to Japan. After Japan's surrender, life in the colonies took a sudden and dramatic shift. Hostile local populations, who for the most part had suffered under Japanese rule, surrounded Japanese colonists. Kuromoto's home was quickly becoming a strange place for her and her fellow Japanese, but even so, she could not comprehend the need to return to Japan, because Manchuria had been her family's home for 3 generations. In her mind, she was already home. However, as the world around Kuromoto began to collapse, she would feel differently. In her memoir, Kuromoto described Manchuria as a living hell, of not knowing who in a crowd might attack over some past grievance against the Japanese. The experiences of this living hell, along with repatriation, would unite Kuromoto with other colonists, all the while furthering their separation from their Naichi counterparts. Hammond writes that Japanese citizens both at home and abroad had long endured the propaganda of Imperial Japan, which nurtured an intense love for the emperor and the state of Japan. Yet when Kazuko Kuromoto was repatriated, she wondered, why then do I feel a stranger? Children who had grown up in the colonies had been taught that they were symbols of Japan's imperial might in Asia. The Japanese soldiers, too, had been held in the highest esteem, receiving gifts from villages back in Japan during the war. And before we conclude talking about Manchuria, I think it's worth touching on the fate of the soldiers who were stationed there, and who for the most part surrendered to Soviet forces. Around 500,000 or more Japanese prisoners were taken by the Soviet Union, and nearly 100,000 would die in labor camps before they were repatriated back to Japan themselves. Manchuria and parts of northern China were also no stranger to concentration of Japanese settlers, or to the mass suicides of settlers previously discussed. Another important element in understanding the real-world parallels to the Eldian people within Attack on Titan is the recruitment and deployment of Eldian fighting groups, oftentimes containing children, to be used by Marley against their enemies in various wars. While this does bear similarity to the forced conscription of Japanese personnel during the Chinese Civil War, I believe it shares a much closer parallel to the recruitment of Japanese Americans after the concentration of Japanese American citizens following the outbreak of war. After all, Japanese Americans were rounded up, robbed of almost everything they had, and forcibly placed in camps. And Japanese American units did fight in various theaters throughout the Second World War for the United States Armed Forces. And this deep parallel adds to the series of deep parallels that Isayama is putting forth here. And so we can see a reading of Attack on Titan that views Eldia through the lens of Imperial Japan provides a much more accurate reading than a lens that attempts to read Eldia as a metaphor for the Holocaust. A reading of the story with Eldia paralleled to Imperial Japan also allows us to re-examine the helmets and uniforms of Marley. After all, German-made equipment was not exclusively used by Germany at this time, and many nations and arms suppliers contributed to the ongoing wars in China that were raging prior to and after the Second World War. Viewing Attack on Titan this way also begins to cast a new light on the way Attack on Titan presents in world history. Throughout the series, the idea is put in front of the reader and the main characters that the history of Eldia and the Eldian people is somehow false, and this is in universe ultimately proven to be true when it's revealed that the outside world does in fact exist, and that Eldia is not the sole bastion of humanity on Earth. And it's in this idea of a hidden history, or of the cover-up of history so as to falsify reality, that we find an intersection between Attack on Titan and one of our most unfortunate topics that we have to cover. Because as I hope to have presented, Attack on Titan is following in the tradition of revisionism within anime and manga. It is not inventing something new. And I think it will behoove us to take a look at a far more direct example of revisionist manga. Yoshinori Kobayashi is a modern Japanese fascist thinker and mangaka. He is simultaneously one of the most comically arrogant and one of the most unimaginably hateful people whose writings you could encounter on the internet. He is the author, and I guess one could say star, of Neo-Gomanism, a series about why Japanese fascism was actually super based, and why the West is generally super terrible. Except, I guess, for their titles, because as you will note, he stole one from Clausewitz. Yoshinori has a hatred of many things, and trying to list all of them would be nearly impossible. A few notable ones, however, include women generally. He's just not particularly fond of them. He has a particular hatred for women who were victims of the Japanese army, however. Leftists, again, just broadly. Peace, which he absolutely cannot stand. And whales not being eaten. He utterly despises the idea of whales not being eaten, and views it as an existential threat to Japanese national security. the guy generally just has a slew of very unfortunate opinions. So why are we talking about this guy if he's so unfortunate? Well, as I hope you will have noticed, he has an intersection with almost every aspect of what we've been talking about in the last hour. He notably even was a member of the Society for Textbook Reform. He's involved in pushing revisionism around Japan's involvement and abuses in Korea. He appeals to a return to an older Japanese way and a rejection of the West, in spite of borrowing heavily from Westerners. And he expresses the same general anti-peace sentiments for the same reasons as we've encountered with prior fascist thinkers. He is both a quintessential fascist and a quintessential Japanese fascist. And much like Ryotaro Shiba, the author of Saka no Ui no Kumo, I believe it's highly likely that a young Isayama encountered his work, and that said work was formative on Isayama's writing process when he began to create Attack on Titan. My two main reasons for thinking this are structure and content, and artistic influence. With regards to structure and content, Chapter 1 of the Attack on Titan manga, as well as the first installment of Neo-Gaimanism, share a commentary on the illusionary nature of peace and of the alleged weakness that develops in a state of peace. And while there are some very obvious differences, they come at the discussion in a very similar way, and much of the language used in Attack on Titan mirrors Yoshinori's manga. Now, while Yoshinori can only fantasize about war and mock those who embrace a state of peace, Isayama is able to toy with this concept a little bit further, like in Neo-Gaimanism, where the author is a know-it-all who is talking down to the ignorant world that is in need of some hubris. In the first chapter of Attack on Titan, Eren Yeager, a literal child, is talking down to the idiot guards who don't understand that their lives are in imminent danger because peace is an illusion. He and Armin both mock the ignorance of people within the walls who believe in the perpetuation of peace, before that peace is finally shattered by the appearance of the Colossal Titan. When it comes to the artistic direction of Attack on Titan, and indeed the depiction of the Titans themselves, I believe that we can also see some similarities and strong parallels. I cannot vouch for how influential any work actually was on Isayama. However, there are certain undeniable characteristics, and again, undeniable similarities and parallels, that I think, along with many of the scenes in the first chapter, indicate an influence that comes from Yoshinori's work. Attack on Titan is perpetuating the intellectual tradition while repackaging the content. By embracing a fantasy storytelling setting, Isayama is able to much more freely toy with these concepts and present right-wing and revisionist Japanese ideas in ways that wouldn't be possible in a work like Yoshinori's without severe criticism and limitations for mass audience adoption. To return to earlier, the story of the Eldians is an attempt to parallel the atrocities of the Holocaust to treatments and suffering of Japanese settlers, in an attempt to garner sympathy for Imperial Japan and the Imperial Japanese colonial project. This is, as was described in a previous essay, a way of granting victim status to victimizers. And we should surely be able to take a look at the suffering of Japanese settler colonists and of the experiences they went through. However, paralleling their experiences to the experiences of Jews during the Holocaust, particularly in a work that simultaneously glorifies figures from the Nazi army, is simply tone-deaf and rather absurd in the best of lights. And given that we've already observed that the manga and anime stray deeply into threads of fascist thinking and fascist concepts, as well as perpetuating fascist ideas, and most notably fascist calls to action, I do not believe we should offer the anime the most charitable light when we examine its content. And thus, to finally answer our Quora friend's question, I believe there is no way of looking at Attack on Titan that doesn't view it as sympathetic to a positive or revisionist view of Imperial Japan and Imperial Japanese figures. And with that, I think it's time for us to move on to part 5 of the video. So here we go, part 5, talking about all of this.
You can disagree with this, but the way this series was supposed to end and should have ended was with an 100% rumbling.
In fact, if you go to any social media site where Attack on Titan is being discussed, you will likely find people justifying genocide and even open fascists. But why?
You don't have to like Attack on Titan, but you should, at the very least, engage with it earnestly and maybe, check some of the claims that are going around.
Like I said before, I believe that Attack on Titan is fundamentally against the argument of the greater good, which, by the way, is a fascist argument.
Is fucking Japanese. He does not give two shits about American politics. I don't know what Japan's politics looking like, but it's probably not as dog shit as American politics. I don't think anybody's politics is as dog shit as American politics.
It definitely is going to be a polarizing end.
You made it. We're finally here. It's the end of the video, where it all comes together. Hopefully, at least. So, have you figured out what was going on with the discourse in Attack on Titan yet? Have you figured out why we weren't able to talk about it, that well? Because the phrase you see thrown around a lot is media literacy. But I hope to have demonstrated that while media literacy may be an issue, it's the aspect of media literacy at hand that's kind of more important. Because what's lacking a lot of the times here in analyzing Attack on Titan seems to be historical or maybe political literacy, more than just your general ability to watch a movie and kind of tell about the vibe or something like that. Now, we've talked about an awful lot of stuff in this video so far, so I don't want to overload the ending of the video, but we're finally here and we finally get to have a little conversation about talking about the show. So I think it is worth doing that for a little minute at least. It took me a great deal of time to really get a handle on analyzing this show and to dive deep enough to feel comfortable to talk about all the various aspects that I thought needed to be discussed. And what came to my attention, at least, in that process was the fact that very little actual diligence had been done in discussing the show broadly in general. We talked about Attack on Titan a little bit, but very few people had ever made a serious effort to actually talk about Attack on Titan. I mentioned creator Lost Futures earlier in the video, and I wanted to bring them up again because I think they're one of the few people who were actually attempting to dive in and have a serious conversation about the anime. But a discussion can't be comprised of one person alone, and so if other creators and other individuals aren't willing to put in the same amount of work, and aren't willing to take the same amount of effort to really explore a topic, it leaves us with an inadequacy in the discussion. It leaves us with very few voices actually able to tell us anything about the series, or to take conversing about it seriously. And with Attack on Titan, I do get it. I get it with anime in general, actually. Anime is one of those things that is often extremely beloved by people, and it's not really very common, I would think, for people to super deeply analyze the shows they like. They just watch something and you kind of vibe with it, you had a fun time watching it. But like I said, I think for most people you watch something and it resonates with you, or an aspect resonates with you, and then you can get kind of defensive if somebody wants to criticize your favorite anime or your show. And Attack on Titan is widely prolific around the world. For many people, this might have been their very first anime. This might have been the very first anime they liked. So I do get being defensive around the series and being defensive around criticism and analysis of the series. And I want to make it very, very clear here at the end of the video. If you liked Attack on Titan, if you watched Attack on Titan and you enjoyed it, I'm not calling you a Nazi. I'm not calling you a fascist, and I'm not calling you a defender of Imperial Japan. You might have just watched the show and thought it was fun. And even when I was watching it, there are certainly aspects of the show and certainly parts that are fun. I found myself on many occasions wondering what was going to happen next. But if you watched Attack on Titan and you listened to some of this discourse and dialogue and you said, this is super based and actually what the world is missing is the philosophical messaging of Attack on Titan, you might be uncomfortably close to things that you're not super comfortable with, and that certainly most other people aren't super comfortable with. And it might be time to back up off the internet and anime for a little bit and take some time to sort out your political views. Because, as I think I have demonstrated through no small amount of work, Attack on Titan really can be classified as a fascistic piece of media. And I understand for some people that might be kind of harsh. Oh my god, they're politicizing and destroying the anime. But that's not a really realistic way of looking at it. The author is a person who grew up in a real time period on planet Earth. He has real political views, he has a real life, he has his own perspective on the world and on history. And pretending like the anime doesn't do or say any of the stuff that it definitely does and says doesn't really help anybody, and it doesn't really do us any services in terms of understanding the show or being able to talk about it. So what's the big takeaway here? That's how videos end, right? There's gotta be a big takeaway, right? So what I would say about all of this is that people need to be a little bit more comfortable with two big things. One is going out and learning about stuff. Books are actually pretty cool. And I get that YouTube videos and short clips and things like that are easily accessible ways of digesting information. Not that the internet isn't an actual tool of learning, but it in and of itself is not complete. And we need to get a little bit more comfortable, just as, people in general, with not pre-forming an opinion without doing some research. This is advice I would put forth to video essayists, and it's advice I would put forward to people who just want to be writing a comment in the comment section. Maybe go spend a little time, get familiar with the topic you want to comment on, get familiar with the topic you want to make a video on, and then do your work, And number two, I would say it's probably a good time for a lot of people to just learn to say they don't know anything about a particular topic. That's a lesson that I think is powerful for anybody to learn, but particularly might be useful for people approaching these kinds of topics. Again, we live in a time period where we're becoming very critical about how creators use information to generate profit, and whether or not they're being honest as to how they collect their information, how they present it, and whether or not they even have any idea what the fuck they're talking about are all really important things that should be focused on. We should care, and we should be able to say, I don't know, I don't have an answer, I can't make a video for you on this because I don't have the information. And I completely get that that's difficult. Like, I already had a pretty extensive background diving into some of this stuff, but for the latter half of the video, I had to do a lot of homework, a lot of research, a lot of reading. So the TLDR of it is, we need to get a bit better. We as commenters, we as viewers, we as fandom members, we need to do a little bit more to do our homework, to be able to talk about these things. This is what's fundamentally wrong with so many discussions. There's a lot of people who don't really know what they're talking about, who have very strong opinions about the topic. And they're vying out there in the world to put out those opinions. And everyone else is vying to consume them. And it generates an environment that makes it virtually impossible for us to actually talk about anything. There is also so much that got left out of this video. There is at least an hour and a half of information that was cut that I would have loved to have included, that you would probably love to be looking at, and I really strongly encourage you to go read anything I managed to put in the sources and resources section and to explore these topics greater. Let's make an actual discourse out of this. Let's do what was not done in the past. Let's talk about Attack on Titan. So, to be honest, I didn't really know exactly how to end this. I thought maybe I should talk for a little bit about how not being able to identify the traits or elements of fascism in like cartoons and works of fiction or whatever is detrimental to our conversations about fascism in the real world. But like, you guys get all that. You're smart, right? You don't need me to explain that for you. That's patronizing. And like, the video's already gone on for like 2 hours. So like, I thought maybe I would just play for you instead, like a funny AMV that I made. Now, I do gotta warn you, I have been accused of having a touch of the dark humor, so, some of you may find this funnier than others, but I thought it was kind of funny, so yeah, let's watch the AMV.
ミカさん、お前はどうして俺のことを気にかけてくれるんだ？ 子供の頃俺に助けられたからか、それとも俺は家族だからか。俺はお前のなんだ。
あなたは家族。